If you are hearing this, it may already be too late to pretend you don't know the truth, because the pattern you keep calling confusion is actually clarity you keep rejecting. And there is a message, not from noise, not from people, but from the deepest place of truth inside your life. And it is this: you are not being tested, you are being shown. Think about it. How many times has someone crossed your boundaries and you called it misunderstanding? How many times did you feel drained but told yourself, I just need to be more patient? How many times did you shrink your needs just to keep someone else comfortable? Because here is what no one likes to admit. When you abandon yourself repeatedly, life doesn't get softer, it gets louder. Not to punish you, but to wake you up. People often ignore emotional warnings until life forces clarity through discomfort, and this is one of the most important psychological patterns in human relationships. When something repeatedly feels off, whether it is inconsistency, disrespect, emotional neglect, or confusion, your mind usually notices it long before you are willing to accept it. But instead of trusting that early signal, most people override it with explanations that feel more tolerable. They tell themselves the other person is just stressed, not like that all the time, or will eventually understand. In reality, this is not confusion about the situation, it is resistance to accepting what the situation is already showing. The mind prefers hope over truth when truth threatens emotional attachment. So instead of seeing repeated behavior as data, people treat it as exceptions. One kind moment becomes the real them, while 10 dismissive moments are treated as accidents. This distortion is not stupidity, it is emotional survival. The brain tries to preserve attachment even when the attachment is costing self-respect. But over time, this creates a painful gap between what you feel internally and what you choose to accept externally. That gap is where anxiety, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion grow. What makes this pattern especially powerful is that it does not begin dramatically. It starts subtly. A boundary is crossed lightly, and you stay silent. A need is ignored, and you adjust. A discomfort arises, and you rationalize it. Each moment on its own feels small, even reasonable, but collectively they form a slow erosion of self-trust. You begin to question your own reactions more than you question the behavior causing them. This is how emotional clarity gets buried under repeated self-doubt. The important shift happens when you understand that emotional discomfort is not random noise, it is information. When something consistently drains you, confuses you, or requires constant justification, it is already communicating a truth about fit, respect, or alignment. Life does not usually reveal this truth in a single moment. It reveals it through repetition. And the more you delay acknowledging it, the louder and more painful the pattern becomes. Not because life is punishing you, but because your awareness is finally catching up to what it has been trying to show you all along. Repeated disrespect is not confusion, and it is not something that requires more analysis, because clarity is already present in the pattern itself. When someone consistently crosses your boundaries, dismisses your feelings, forgets what matters to you, or only shows care when it benefits them, your mind may still try to interpret it in softer ways. You may think you just need better communication, more patience, or the right timing to be understood. But repetition removes ambiguity. One mistake can be explained, a pattern cannot. What makes this difficult to accept is the emotional attachment you have to the person, or the hope you hold about who they could become. That hope becomes a filter through which every interaction is interpreted. So instead of seeing the behavior for what it is, you start searching for hidden meanings or temporary reasons. You might say they were stressed, distracted, misunderstood you, or didn't realize the impact. And while those explanations may sometimes be true in isolation, they lose meaning when the behavior keeps happening without change. At a psychological level, the mind often tries to protect attachment by minimizing pain. Admitting that someone is repeatedly disrespectful forces you to confront a harder truth, that your emotional investment is not being matched with care or consideration. So, instead of accepting that truth, the mind chooses confusion as a temporary refuge. Confusion feels less painful than acceptance, but confusion also keeps you stuck, because if something is unclear, you feel you still need to solve it, fix it, or wait for clarity to arrive. However, repeated behavior is clarity. It is communication without words. People reveal their emotional priorities through consistency, not promises. When someone values your boundaries, you do not need to enforce them repeatedly for them to be respected. When someone values your feelings, you do not need to justify why they matter. And when someone is invested in the connection, you do not constantly feel like you are negotiating your place in it. The moment you start calling repeated disrespect what it actually is, not a misunderstanding, not a phase, not a mistake you need to correct, you begin to step out of the mental loop that keeps you over-explaining and under-protecting yourself. Because clarity was never missing in their actions, it was only being delayed by your hope. Over-giving without boundaries does not create more love, stability, or safety in relationships. Instead, it slowly leads to emotional depletion and self-loss. It often begins with good intentions, being caring, being available, being understanding, and wanting to make things easier for others. In the beginning, it can even feel meaningful because giving feels like connection. But when giving becomes one-sided and unbalanced, it stops being connection and starts becoming self-erasure. The shift is usually gradual. You start by doing small things beyond your comfort, telling yourself it is temporary or necessary. You adjust your time, your energy, your emotional space, and even your needs to accommodate someone else. At first, it feels like flexibility. But over time, flexibility without limits becomes a pattern where your own needs are always second. You begin to notice that your emotional availability is high for others, but there is very little left for yourself. What makes this dynamic especially draining is that it often comes with a quiet expectation of reciprocity that never fully arrives. You may not openly ask for anything in return, but internally, you start hoping that your effort will naturally be matched. When it is not, instead of pulling back, many people give even more, believing that consistency from them will eventually inspire consistency from the other person. But imbalance rarely corrects itself through more imbalance. Emotionally, overgiving without boundaries can also create a subtle identity shift. You begin to feel valued only when you are useful. Your sense of worth becomes tied to how much you can do, fix, support, or accommodate. And when you are not giving, you may feel anxious, unnecessary, or even invisible. This is where self-worth quietly becomes conditional. The most painful part is that depletion does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, through repeated moments where you ignore your own fatigue, silence your discomfort, and push past your limits for the sake of keeping things smooth. Eventually, you reach a point where exhaustion feels normal and rest feels undeserved. Real connection does not require self-abandonment. Healthy bonds do not demand constant overextension from one side. When boundaries are missing, giving stops being an expression of love and becomes a way of earning safety. And anything you have to continuously earn through exhaustion is not stability. It is imbalance disguised as care. Dynamics where guilt replaces boundaries often create relationships that feel emotionally heavy, confusing and draining, even when nothing is openly dramatic. Instead of clear respect for personal limits, there is a constant emotional pressure to comply, explain, or justify yourself. Guilt becomes the invisible mechanism that keeps you engaged, even when your inner experience is signaling discomfort. You may not notice it at first because it is rarely direct. It often shows up as subtle emotional framing, like making you feel selfish for saying no, difficult for expressing needs, or ungrateful for having boundaries. In these situations, boundaries are not treated as healthy limits. They are treated as offenses. When you attempt to set one, the emotional response you receive is often not understanding, but disappointment, withdrawal, or implied judgment. Over time, you start associating your own needs with the possibility of hurting someone else's feelings. This creates an internal conflict where protecting yourself feels morally uncomfortable, even when it is completely reasonable. What makes guilt so powerful in these dynamics is that it does not need to be loud to be effective. It works quietly through conditioning. You begin to anticipate negative reactions before they even happen, so you adjust yourself in advance. You say yes when you want to say no. You stay available when you are exhausted. You minimize your discomfort because expressing it feels like creating tension. Slowly, your boundaries stop being external actions and become internal restrictions. This also shifts the emotional balance in relationships. Instead of mutual respect, there is an unspoken rule that one person's comfort is more important than the other's boundaries. The person experiencing guilt learns to overfunction emotionally, while the other person becomes accustomed to that overfunctioning. Over time, this imbalance feels normal, even though it is fundamentally unequal. The deepest impact of guilt-based dynamics is the erosion of self-trust. You begin to question whether your needs are valid at all. You second-guess your right to say no. You feel responsible for managing other people's emotions while ignoring your own. And when guilt is consistently prioritized over boundaries, you slowly lose clarity about what you actually want versus what you feel pressured to accept. Healthy relationships do not require emotional self-negotiation every time you express a limit. Boundaries are not rejection, they are structure. When guilt becomes the primary tool shaping your behavior, you are no longer acting from choice. You are reacting from emotional conditioning that keeps your needs consistently in the background. Love without self-respect gradually turns into self-abandonment because it shifts the focus from mutual care to one-sided sacrifice. At the beginning, it may feel like devotion, understanding, or deep emotional investment. You may believe that being more patient, more forgiving, and more accommodating will strengthen the bond. But without self-respect, these qualities stop being balanced expressions of love and become ways of shrinking yourself to maintain connection. Self-respect is what sets the limit on how much you give without losing yourself in the process. When it is missing, you start tolerating things you would normally question. You accept inconsistent behavior because you don't want to seem demanding. You stay silent about hurt because you don't want to create conflict. You adjust your emotional needs to match what the other person is willing to give, instead of expressing what you actually require to feel safe and valued. Over time, this creates a dynamic where your presence becomes flexible, but your needs become invisible. What makes this especially dangerous emotionally is that it often feels like love from the inside. You may tell yourself that you are being loyal, committed, or strong enough to endure. but endurance is not the same as connection. When love requires you to repeatedly override your discomfort, ignore your intuition, or silence your boundaries, it slowly stops being nourishing. Instead of feeling emotionally supported, you begin to feel emotionally stretched. Another layer of this pattern is how it affects identity. When self-respect is consistently set aside, your sense of worth becomes tied to how much you can tolerate or how much you can endure for someone else. You start measuring love by sacrifice rather than mutual care. And the more you sacrifice without reciprocity, the more normalized your own discomfort becomes. Eventually, you stop recognizing where your needs end and where someone else's expectations begin. The hardest realization is that self-abandonment rarely happens in one decision. It happens in repeated small moments where you choose attachment over truth. You stay when something feels wrong. You explain away behavior that hurts you. You silence your instincts because they feel inconvenient. Each moment feels small on its own, but together they reshape how you relate to yourself. Real love does not require losing yourself to keep it. When self-respect is present, love expands both people instead of shrinking one for the comfort of the other. Without it, love becomes a place where you are constantly adjusting yourself just to remain accepted. And over time, that adjustment turns into disappearance from your own emotional life. Silence from others can sometimes carry more truth than words ever will, especially when you are paying attention to patterns instead of promises. When someone cares, their presence is usually consistent in ways that feel steady, not confusing. But when there is emotional inconsistency, withdrawal, or avoidance, silence often becomes a form of communication that is easy to overlook because it is not direct. People tend to focus on what is said, while ignoring what is repeatedly not shown. At first, silence can feel uncertain. You may interpret it in multiple ways. Maybe they are busy. Maybe they need space. Maybe they will come back with clarity later. The mind naturally tries to fill the gap because uncertainty is uncomfortable. So instead of accepting silence as information, you start creating explanations that make it feel less painful. This is where emotional distortion begins, because you are no longer responding to what is actually happening, but to what you hope is happening underneath it. Over time, however, silence is rarely random. When someone consistently chooses not to respond, not to engage, not to show up in meaningful ways, that pattern becomes its own message. It reveals priority, it reveals emotional availability, and it reveals willingness. The absence of effort is not neutral. It communicates limits just as clearly as words do. The difficulty lies in accepting that absence is also a form of clarity. What makes this even more complex is that silence often coexists with occasional moments of attention. A message here, a kind gesture there, a brief return after distance. These moments can feel powerful because they interrupt the pattern of absence. But intermittent connection does not erase consistency. It often highlights inconsistency. And when attention is unpredictable, the emotional system becomes more attached, not less, because unpredictability creates hope cycles. The emotional cost of ignoring silence is that you start investing energy into what is not being sustained. You begin trying to interpret, analyze, and wait for meaning that is already present in the pattern. Meanwhile, your own emotional stability becomes dependent on responses that are not consistent. This creates internal tension, where you are constantly in a state of waiting rather than receiving. When silence is repeated, it is rarely about misunderstanding. It is about limitation or lack of prioritization. Accepting this does not require anger or judgment, only clarity. Because once you stop treating silence as something to decode and start treating it as information, you begin to see the situation as it is, not as you hope it might become. Healing begins when you stop negotiating your worth. Because negotiation implies that your value is still up for discussion. As long as you are trying to prove yourself, explain yourself, or earn basic respect, you are still operating from the belief that something about you needs to be validated externally before it is fully real. This creates a constant emotional effort, where your energy is spent not on growth, but on justification. In many emotional dynamics, people become conditioned to adjust themselves in order to maintain connection. They over-explain their feelings, soften their needs, or reduce their expectations so they are easier to accept. At the surface, this looks like adaptability, but internally it becomes a pattern of self-editing. You begin to measure your worth based on how little friction you create for others, rather than how aligned you feel within yourself. Over time, this weakens internal clarity, because your focus shifts outward instead of inward. Negotiating worth also keeps you stuck in cycles where boundaries are treated as flexible suggestions rather than non-negotiable truths. You set a limit, then retract it when it is not respected. You express discomfort, then minimize it when it creates tension. You ask for change, then accept repetition of the same behavior. Each time this happens, your internal signal weakens slightly, and your tolerance for imbalance increases. This is how emotional exhaustion becomes normalized. Healing begins at the moment you stop re-entering these negotiations. It is not about becoming distant or rigid. It is about becoming internally clear. You no longer try to convince people to treat you better. You observe how they already treat you and respond accordingly. This shift moves you out of persuasion and into awareness. Instead of asking, "How can I make them understand my worth?" you start asking, "Why am I still explaining something that should already be respected?" When worth is no longer negotiable, relationships become clearer. Some connections naturally strengthen because they were already aligned with mutual respect. Others become uncomfortable because they relied on your flexibility, not your clarity. This discomfort is not loss, it is revelation. It shows you where effort was one-sided and where your self-abandonment was maintaining stability that was not truly stable. The beginning of healing is not perfection, it is refusal. The refusal to shrink further, to explain further, or to chase understanding where respect is already absent. From that point onward, your energy shifts from proving your value to protecting it, and that shift changes not just your relationships, but your entire internal experience of yourself. The most painful truth in many emotional experiences is that life does not usually reveal itself through one dramatic moment. It reveals itself through repetition. People often wait for a clear sign, a final event, or an undeniable breaking point before they believe what is already consistently being shown. But clarity is rarely sudden. It builds slowly, through patterns that repeat until they become impossible to ignore. What feels confusing is often already consistent. The inconsistency is not in the behavior, it is in the interpretation. You may experience repeated disappointment, repeated emotional distance, or repeated imbalance, yet still hold on to the idea that something will eventually shift. This creates a cycle where reality keeps speaking through patterns, while hope keeps rewriting the meaning of those patterns. The mind resists acceptance when acceptance requires emotional change. So instead of seeing repetition as information, it is often treated as something temporary. Each instance is isolated, explained, and softened. But when you step back, repetition removes all ambiguity. It becomes a language of its own. And that language is not about potential. It is about presence, consistency, and capacity. At some point, the emotional weight of repetition becomes undeniable. Not because anything new has happened, but because nothing has changed. That is often the moment awareness begins to shift. You start to realize that waiting for clarity was actually delaying it, because clarity was never absent. It was simply being overlooked in favor of emotional attachment. This realization is not always comfortable, because it asks you to trust what you already felt but did not act on. It asks you to stop negotiating with patterns that have already defined themselves, and it asks you to accept that understanding does not require more time. It requires willingness to see what has already been consistent. When repetition is finally seen for what it is, the emotional fog begins to lift. You no longer need additional proof, additional explanations, or additional cycles to confirm what has already been demonstrated. What remains is simple awareness that consistency has been speaking all along, and clarity was never waiting for more time. It was waiting to be believed. So here is what all of this quietly comes down to. The message was never hidden, and it was never complicated. It was present in the discomfort you felt but explained away, in the boundaries you softened to keep peace, in the exhaustion you normalized, in the silence you kept trying to interpret, and in the patterns you kept hoping would change without requiring you to see them clearly. The message was always this: you do not need more evidence to trust what is already consistently true. You do not need more time to validate what repetition has already revealed. And you do not need to keep negotiating with situations that keep asking you to abandon yourself in smaller and smaller ways just to remain inside them. Because when something is right for your emotional well-being, you do not spend most of your time decoding it. You do not feel consistently confused, depleted, or uncertain about where you stand. You do not have to constantly adjust your voice, your needs, or your boundaries just to be received. There is a natural sense of steadiness, even when challenges exist. And when something is not aligned, life does not always remove it immediately. It shows you through repetition until you finally stop dismissing what you already feel. That is not punishment. That is awareness trying to reach you through every channel you keep overlooking. So the real shift is not in what happens outside of you. It is in what you stop doing internally. You stop shrinking to keep access. You stop explaining what should already be respected. You stop waiting for clarity to arrive from someone else's behavior, and you start recognizing it in your own experience. Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself to maintain connection, you finally hear what was always being shown. Truth does not need convincing, only acceptance.